so much for coming to our public forum tonight on fossil fuel divestment. This is a co-hosted event from Divest Harvard and the Harvard Political Union. We first want to extend our deepest gratitude to President Bacow for joining us tonight, so thank you. And now we're going to turn... So before I turn it over to Matthew, I'm going to say the topic of tonight's public forum is fossil fuel divestment. So for those of you who don't know much about this, you're going to learn a lot more. The 350.org defines divestment as the opposite of investment. It simply means getting rid of stocks, bonds, or investment funds that are unethical or morally ambiguous.
All right. So, as Alana just mentioned, my name is Matthew Miller, and I'm the chair of the Harvard Political Union. And our mission is to promote open discourse on Harvard's campus and hear from all sides on pressing issues. And that's why we're so excited and appreciative that we have representatives from both sides for tonight's debate, or forum, I should say. So, let's keep it with forum. So, in order to engage in respectful dialogue, we just ask that you hold any comments or things that you want to say until the question and answer portion that we have at the end, and that you hear out all of the speakers and wait until that question and answer period if you have something to say. And so without further ado, we're really excited to have the following speakers at tonight's forum. I'll briefly read you a quick description on each of them, and then we'll give them each about 2 minutes to introduce themselves. So first we have Cornel West, professor of the practice of public philosophy. We have Jim Anderson, the Philip S. Weld Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry. We have President Larry Bacow, the 29th President of Harvard University. We also have Professor Jim Engell, the Gurney Professor of English and Professor of Comparative Literature. And we have Karen Shapiro, a financial advisor at Progressive Asset Management and an alumnus of the Harvard School of Public Health. So like I said, we're going to turn it over to our distinguished guests. We can start with Karen, if that's all right with you on this side, and work our way that way. We'll give you about 2 minutes or so if you just want to share sort of your background, your general perspective, and then we'll get into some questions. So Karen, whenever you're ready, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. As I was talking to some folks here, I told them that when I graduated from the School of Public Health, if you ever told me that I was going to be a financial advisor, I would have told you, what did you have to eat today? It was the furthest thing from my mind, but the short of it is how I became a financial advisor was I got very interested in how, when you are a shareholder of a company, you can use that power to get your foot in the door and have a seat at the table to talk to companies. And what I have learned through my work is that there's times where so-called dialogue, talking to companies on specific issues, works. So, for example, many years ago, I did some work with a environmental group and Limited Brands, which was the parent company of Victoria's Secret. Victoria's Secret was sending out all these catalogs all the time back in the good old paper days, and the paper was being irresponsibly sourced. The environmental group had women that dressed up like the angels, but wielding a chainsaw, saying Victoria's dirty secret, and it was a full-page ad in the New York Times. And that really finally got the company to talk, and they changed their practices as to where they were going to be sourcing their paper fiber. However, certain types of issues don't lend themselves to shareholder dialogue to spur change. And fossil fuels is one of those where shareholder dialogue is not going to change the ExxonMobils of the world and get them to stop digging because that's all they know how to do. That's what they are equipped to do. And so it's in situations like that where divestment really becomes our only solution.
That was actually perfectly timed at 2 minutes.
Jim Engell. I graduated from the college in 1973. And when I was young, everyone in my family thought I would be a scientist. And I spent some of my early years in science, including at the Jackson Laboratory up in Maine, and studied science here as well. But then I turned to literature and never lost, however, my environmental interests. So I teach environmental literature. I also had an experience before I even came to college. I worked in a stockbroker's office. And that was the first permanent job ever offered me. I was told that I could come and work in that office after I graduated from college. So I got a little taste of the world of finance then, and continued to be interested in it. I want to use the remaining time I have in this 2 minutes just to say a couple of things. We here in this panel, and I'm sure many people here, probably agree on the ends but not on the means. Samuel Johnson, in fact, says that humankind usually agrees on ends, but not on means. I think that's important to realize. There is a difference of opinion about what means will be effective. I just want to say a few things. I hope if the university believes that engagement is effective, that they will publish a list of very particular things in engagement that have resulted, and give a chronological list of that. If engagement is something that we need, it needs to show results. Another thing I would like to say is that this is an urgent matter because there is a stopwatch. More CO2 was put into the atmosphere last year than any year in history by human beings. The IPCC and other reports say that we're going to have to drastically reduce in the next 12 years. It's been only 5.5 years since the corporation announced its policy on October 3rd, 2013, that it would not divest from fossil fuels. Well, now that's 5.5 years ago, and the world situation is worse with regard to climate change. We have enough fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas in known reserves to burn that would put us far, far above the 2015 Paris Accord agreement. Why one would want to invest in further capital expenditures for exploration and extraction and consider that to be a good thing to do in order to prevent the crisis that we are all facing, a crisis that will hit the poor the hardest. It's a human rights issue. Is something that I have to question. This is not merely a matter of social change. This is a matter of planetary fate in the long term.
All right, thank you.
So one of the things which we all have in common, I think, is we probably, none of us would have predicted we would wind up doing what we're doing now when we were getting out of college. And I guarantee you, in my wildest dreams, I never imagined I would be sitting here before you as the president of Harvard. And I guarantee you that there wasn't a single person who knew me back then who would have thought it possible either.
Not even your mother?
Not even my mother. But life happens. One of the things which you should know about me is that I spent my entire scholarly career at MIT teaching environmental policy. I was the co-founder of the Center for Environmental Initiatives at MIT. I chaired the Council on the Environment at MIT. I oversaw a major partnership called the Alliance for Global Sustainability between MIT and ETH Zurich and the University of Tokyo. As we were all working together to try and identify ways in which we as academic institutions, in fact, could address some of the problems that Jim has so eloquently stated. There is no disagreement among any of them in decarbonizing the electric grid. If you want to think about carbon capture, one needs to be willing to work actually with the industries whose behavior we need to change. And So I think it's really difficult for us to say on the one hand that morally we find it offensive to even own one's stock, and at the same time say, but by the way, we also want to work with you because we need to work together if we're going to address these critically important problems.
Thank you.
Well, first I just want to salute the students who request to become decent human beings and active citizens tied to public interest and common good, that you help facilitate this kind of public forum. Very important that we have Socratic dialogue and have a deep commitment to Socratic dialogue. What Whitman put it, to be able to enter public space without humiliation and engage in serious argument, evidence, being explicit about our visions and so forth. That's what Ready Talks is about. That's the question that you raised. What kind of community do we really want to be? And of course, there's going to be a variety of responses, but that's a fundamental question. And the commitment to veritas, the truth, and the greatest of all public philosophers, probably the most adorable, William James. So love him. Right here, Emerson, for 40-some years. The truth is a species of the good. Our very conceptions of reality have something to do with our moral life. And therefore, for me in part, it's a philosophical question with tremendous political and practical consequences, which is to say, how do we go about reflecting on the ethical elements in our very investment deliberations? Different people can have different views about this thing, but we need to have a public discussion about it. I arrived 49 years ago as a freshman at Hallworthy. I've had a blessed life. And it was true. We had this struggle in 1972 over Angola investments. Later on it was tobacco. Later on it was South Africa. These are positive signs of people who want to be decent human beings and want to be active citizens. So that the question becomes, trying to make very, very lucid and clear, are there any ethical elements in investment deliberations? And if so, exactly what are they? I'm sure that if we had firms tied to the KKK or neo-Nazis, we've got to raise some ethical questions. And if that's so, then at what point do we begin to draw the line where we say, in fact, that there's certain ones we won't and there's certain ones that we will? So fossil fuel industry, serious debate. We had a debate the other night with the at Emerson dealing with the prison industry. There's going to be a host of other kinds of questions. But we have to be able to do this in such a way that's mediated by mutual respect, but at the same time, people understand the passion and the righteous indignation. And we've got to make sure all the channels are open. Once the channels are closed, you're going to get what we did in 1972. We took over the president's office. We stayed there. I was president of the black people. But still, we were respectful when we went in and when we went out. I had to take my Hebrew exam, but I went right back. But the point is, we want to make sure that you have these kinds of forums. That's why it's very important for you to be here. That's crucial. Because we have to have reasons, arguments, and it's going to be intense. We're going to have disagreements because in the end, as human beings, we all want to be decent. We all want to be active citizens. And we're concerned about the future of the planet, the future of the kind of primates that we are and other primates and other animals. Amen.
Well, I'm Jim Anderson, and my first piece of advice is never come after Cornel. I'm in the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology, Earth and Planetary Sciences, and Seas. And I come to this because I am involved in the collision between chemistry, physics, and climate. And this started out as an example. We built the instruments that flew in NASA U-2 into the Antarctic and established unequivocally that the Antarctic ozone hole was caused by chlorine from chlorofluorocarbons. And the ensuing Senate hearings and international negotiations that went into the Montreal Protocol to ban chlorofluorocarbons was a fundamental intersection of science and public policy. And in that process, I learned two things. One, the science has to be unequivocal. The second thing is that the visceral response of human beings to a particular situation is fundamental to active motion in the public policy sector. And in the case of the Antarctic, it's ultraviolet radiation, and we went on to discover that the same chemistry was occurring in the Arctic. In fact, the United States didn't sign the Montreal Protocol until a mission we had discovered that there was high chlorine radicals that attack ozone over the state of Maine. Then, in February of 1992, finally the United States signed the protocol. Now, that lesson taught me that people do not respond to gentle innuendo. They respond to a visceral reaction to what's actually occurring. And this is why I speak not in glowing terms about the word global warming, because it has no imperative behind it. People don't care about 1 or 2 Celsius. The real issue is the irreversible flow of heat into subsystems of the climate that you cannot recover from. Fundamentals tell you that the flow of heat has taken out 80% of permanent Arctic ice in just 30 years. The increase in severe storms is driven entirely by the release of energy from moisture coming off the Gulf of Mexico and off the sea. Droughts are created by this extreme sensitivity of soil moisture to temperature. Agricultural instability is generated by this remarkable drought tendency with just a small amount of loss of moisture. The wildfires that are sweeping California, that's another example of both a biological impact because the pine beetle is destroying the trees. They were killed by the sun and cold. Now they provide tinder that is sweeping through California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia. And if you look at sea level rise in combination with storm surge, that is affecting insurance rates, it's affecting trillions of dollars of value in real estate because the bonds that are being floated no longer have value because what they are, the municipalities are trying to build will be underwater in less time than the bond payoff is. And the irreversible nature of this is the thing that we have to deal with, and the fact that my generation gave to you a planet that is uninhabitable. If you look at refugee flow triggered by food shortages, Syria, Africa, Central America, that refugee flow is a perfect example of societal destabilization. And I think it's unacceptable to be involved in any financial aspect that advances fossil fuels in any way, because we know from the science that there's a vastly better way. Fossil fuels might have worked for the first 2 decades in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but when you look at the fundamental science under this, it's unacceptable that those fossil fuels are still driving the economy.
Thank you guys so much for sharing your perspectives with us. Q&A. We just want to ask a few questions for our speakers to get some more of these ideas flowing. So we ask that you please keep your responses brief, even though we're very eager to hear what you have to say. So that said, the first question is mostly directed towards Professors West and Anderson. How can divestment be a tool for environmental and social justice?
Speak into the microphone.
And you said never follow Cornell, so you have to go first.
That's exactly right. I appreciate that.
Could you ask the question again?
Yeah. So how can divestment be a tool for environmental and social justice?
Oh, I think this comes back to moral leadership, and it comes back to the fundamentals of why we have a university. We have a university to enlighten people about their future and what they're doing in that future. And if we have something that is fundamentally cross-threaded with that vision of the university, the leadership, the moral leadership, the information that is distributed by this university, if we have something that is counter to that, directly confronts that fundamental idea, that fundamental philosophy, I think it's unacceptable.
I would want to draw a distinction though between political use and ethical witness. Ethical witness is a broader terrain. Political use tends to presuppose a certain kind of agreement among a political group. And so it's much more difficult to pursue such an effort in a liberal educational institution. A liberal educational institution does not take explicitly ideological positions. It invites in the public sphere a variety of voices, but those variety of voices still have to have some ethics. So you can be right-wing, you can be central, you can be left-wing, and you still want to be an ethical person. And so when we talk about ethical witness, it's a broader zone. So that when I hear the claim about we don't want to use this particular instrument for social change, we don't want to use this particular for political use, I say, okay, those are too ideologically charged. Let's just talk about what it means to be an ethical institution. And at that point, then we want to hear what the arguments are as to why you're for or why you're against. And therefore, I think, see, social justice, now that tends to be such a polarizing category. People automatically go in their ideological corners. That's the last thing we want. That's the last thing about Veritas. We're talking about paideia in its deepest sense, which is a certain intellectual and moral awakening that's different than a kind of ideological posturing. And that, to me, is going to be important as we attempt to bring serious argument to bear in various forms of power and pressure.
All right, thank you both. So our next question is for President Bacow. So those opposing divestment have often proposed financial, political, and other justifications in their arguments. So which of these arguments do you think is most central to the case against divestment? And if you could just elaborate more on those reasons.
So, this is a complicated issue. Not the science, I think that's easy. Not the desire for change, that's also easy. But I think it's actually more complicated, and Cornel helps us in the way in which he frames it. Because it's also, I worry that it's easy to make broad moral judgments. Bringing about real meaningful change in society is much harder. I worry about what it means as an institution to say we're going to engage in a series of moral judgments about things, because one of the reasons that people in my position, and this is not, it's not just me, these are decisions, by the way, which are made by the corporation, not just the president. I'm not without influence, I agree, but it's, you know, we need to understand that this is a larger institutional position that gets taken. But one of the reasons why I think most university presidents, whether or not it's Harvard or Yale or Princeton or MIT or Stanford or our peer institutions, have adopted positions not unlike where we find ourselves at Harvard, is that there are a whole variety of issues on which we could be encouraged to take strong moral stands. I wonder what happens the day after divestment. Let's say we were, let's engage in the, you know, in the mental exercise. We do it. What happens next?
Following the celebration.
Do we leave people from the moral responsibility of acting on their own, of actually doing something, as opposed to just encouraging somebody else to take a symbolic act? We will still live in a society in which we still need to make collective efforts as well as individual efforts that require us to make sacrifices, that will require us to change our behavior, that will require us as a nation, as a world, as a planet, to fundamentally alter our behavior. Do we let people off the hook just by saying, fine, the institution has now taken a moral stand? then beyond that, there are lots of other issues which people urge upon us to take a moral stand, or might. And, you know, I have to worry about not just this issue, but the others that might be suggested. And it's why I think that people have consistently, you know, my predecessors have consistently taken the position that, you know, as a first principle, the endowment, it does not exist to be instrumentalized in service to particular causes, however worthy, all right? It's there to support our teaching and our scholarship. But again, to go through the mental exercise, the next day, what happens? If one of our colleagues, if we've concluded that it is morally repugnant to own these stocks, all right, that we wish to distance ourselves completely from this industry, what do I say as a president? I'm looking at you, Jim, as a scientist. For our faculty colleagues who actually want to collaborate and work with one of these firms, who want to accept research support from one of these firms, do we say, no, we're not going to allow you to do that? I suspect if we go down that path, they will raise serious questions about academic freedom, about the will, you know, our willingness to let faculty make these choices on their own. Then there are the other issues that come up. There's a long list of things that in the short period that I've been president of Harvard, that people have come to me and said, we should divest from the following. You've mentioned, you know, prisons, we've talked about climate change here today. There are people who think that we shouldn't be supporting the fast food industry because it encourages obesity, especially amongst the poor. There are people who think that we shouldn't be investing in companies that have their headquarters in states that are not supportive of gender equity, that are not supportive of transgender people. There are people who think that there are companies that we should not be investing in because they are not adequately supportive of gays and lesbians and bisexuals. There are a whole host of issues which, if we want to put on the table, we can take a moral stand. But life actually gets quite complicated, and we need to figure out what are the neutral principles. You know, when do we act? Because there are lots of places where we could do that. And by the way, there are also people who would suggest, in fact, I know where you stand on this, Cornel, that we should divest from companies doing business in certain parts of the world. But I would tell you that I believe my conception of the university is that where reasonable people have different views and perspectives, at least on some of those things, that we exist to encourage debate, to encourage conversation, like we are having, you know, here together. And I fear that at least on some of these issues, not all, but on some,
I'm sorry.
by adopting a position, we end debate, we don't encourage it. Sorry.
No, yes, of course, actually. We'd love to get a few other voices in.
Brother, it's a very important question. I mean, it's clear that Harvard as an institution could not follow one political or ideological line. And that's very important. But then the question becomes, what are the moments in which Harvard, given its immense influence in society, decides to be an ethical thermostat rather than an apolitical thermometer? That's a tremendous force that shaped the climate of opinion. That's a thermostat. If you're going to reflect the climate, okay, that's a thermometer. But Harvard has this tremendous influence on our society. And it's true, we can't hit every issue, but we can debate each and every issue and see the ways in which, for example, what are the young people thinking? What percentage of them have certain kind of moral passions? Doesn't mean that what they say is uncritically accepted, but their voices are voices alongside the voice of the corporation, voices of the faculty. Now I would add staff too. Because they're part of our community too. And there's going to be conclusions that some of us disagree with. And we'll have to say, Well, we intellectually lost that one. There's other ones that we win. And each victory is relative because, as you say, even when Harvard withdraws, it sends tremendous ripples, but you still got tremendous struggles as citizens, as human beings, in trying to deal with some of the larger issues that are raised by these challenges.
I'd like to respond as well. You know, I think the question isn't what should we be divesting from, but rather what should we be investing in. And trying to be more forward-thinking, you know, I don't think today that the university would want to be investing in tobacco because, you know, an industry that kills its customers isn't one that's going to be around hopefully for very long. But on the other hand, there's other types of issues that can be addressed by being a shareholder. So for instance, the issue of workplace standards for child labor, or, you know, eliminating child labor, or for encouraging an all-inclusive environment in an industry, in a particular corporation that includes LGBTQ people. That can be addressed through engaged shareholders. But the issue of changing the type of product that an oil industry is going to produce, unfortunately cannot be addressed that way.
Can we get some quick responses from Professor Anderson and maybe Professor Engell if you want to add something, and then we'd love to open this up for audience Q&A, which I'm sure will spark more conversation.
I'd just like to say a few things that it's true our policy toward divestment is not unlike other institutions, but it's certainly not identical. Stanford has divested from coal. Yale has different guidelines than Harvard does. Middlebury long said it would not divest, and now it has decided to divest. There are an enormous number of institutions in the United States and around the world, including major research universities, who have divested. They seem, therefore, to be able to handle some of the amount of divestment which has occurred recently has been growing. It has not stalled out. And I think it's important to know that while any action may bring with it some downside, the question is what will happen the day after divestment. Other things will be done. It is all hands on deck. Divesting here and there does not mean you give up other things. It just means you continue with other things, no longer believing that the money that you are investing is going to further exploration and extraction of fossil fuels. That's what it means. I don't think it can make you feel morally superior. I don't think it makes you free to then lord it over any other kind of policy. I don't think it releases you from your responsibility to do other things, including your own personal life. You have to follow what you believe is right in that regard. So divestment is a tool, but it's only one of many tools. It's an action that's only one of many possible actions. Harvard has, in my lifetime, divested 3 times. I'm not Methuselah. Not that old. It divested from South Africa after long and open debate. It divested from tobacco after relatively short debate, by a sudden decision in many ways by President Bach and the corporation, and it divested from certain businesses in Darfur for human rights reasons. Right. Now, those are all important. At 3 times in 40 years doesn't mean it's once in 100 blue moons.
Sorry to cut you off, but just in the interest of time, we're going to try to get Professor Anderson and then President Bacow to respond really quickly, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A.
So first of all, I have a great deal of affection for you, so everything I say is within that envelope. But you list this entire litany of problems, and that diffuses the central focus on what we're doing here tonight. And I think Jim pointed out that the sequence of what Harvard divested from is a perfect example of how progress can be made, because divesting from smoking is actually directly related to health, but fossil fuel impact on human health globally is staggeringly more important than smoking. The other point you made was that individual response to this is in some way decoupled from the leadership and truth at Harvard making the decision to divest. For example, I think now walking to work, and as many PS11 students know, driving an electric car, taking those individual actions is based on my information. But when people see Harvard divest, that sends a real message that this is an important thing, and they've got to think about what they're doing, and eventually, that's where I think the future is.
All right, thank you. And yeah, President Bacow.
So, Jim is good to remind us when we have divested in our history, but I would just note that in each of those cases, when we did, we basically severed all relationship with the activity that we were talking about. Whether or not it was South Africa, it was Darfur. Tobacco was actually, I think, an interesting case because it wasn't just that we said we weren't going to own tobacco stocks. We don't allow people to sell tobacco on our campus. We don't allow people to consume tobacco on our campus. Our medical school, our School of Public Health, made collective decisions that they would not accept support from tobacco companies for research related to tobacco. The day after, if we were to divest, we're still going to turn on the lights. We will still be dependent upon fossil fuel. We still will be consuming the things. We will be dependent upon the companies that we seek to shun. And my position is that we need to engage with them to change their behavior, not just through the stocks that we own, but we need to engage with them in multiple dimensions. We also need to do more than that, and we are. We've made a commitment as an institution, and we are working hard collectively to try and reduce our carbon footprint, and successfully. We've made a commitment to try and be a demonstration project. This is how I think we actually show that we mean what we say, and we do it in a way so that the rest of the world can actually learn from us. And I must respectfully disagree. I actually think we need to be modest about what kind of influence we think we're going to have if we take this action. There's a big chunk of the world that's going to thumb their nose at us if we do this and say we are once again, in their view, being politically correct. I'm not saying that's an argument for acting or not acting. I'm just saying that is what will happen. Not all of the response will be as positive as one might hope. Again, if we're going to bring about changes in policy, we need to persuade the people who disagree with us. I actually wrote a book 35, 40 years ago in which I said, one of the big mistakes that people make who want to change the world is they spend too much time talking to their friends and not enough time talking to the people who disagree with them. We need to engage with those that we disagree with.
I want to thank you all again, and with that said, I think we're going to open up for some questions from the audience. Yes. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. My name is Salma. I am an organizer with the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign, a campaign that has been repeatedly left out of this conversation. We have also engaged with you civilly throughout the past, and I'm speaking to you, President Bacow. We've engaged with you civilly over the past couple of months on repeated occasions, have submitted a petition to you that garnered 3,400 signatures, have gone to your office hours and spoken with you several times about the issue of prison divestment. And repeatedly, our reasons have been framed as incivility and hostility. So I just want to call out what's happening in this room today. The elephant in the room is that the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign is not here, right? And we were also, this is going to be a question.
Okay.
Yeah. We were also at the event on Thursday where we asked you and demanded that you spoke to us after not having listened to us for several months. There was skepticism about our involvement in this event that was potentially the reason why you wouldn't come. And there was skepticism about Professor West being on this panel. So I'm just going to call out what racism looks like in this room today. Our reasons have not been framed as demands. Any way that we have engaged with you civilly around this issue that speaks truly to the urgency of the prison industrial complex will always be viewed in the eyes of white fragility as demands and as uncivility and hostility. So I just want to call that out.
Is there a question?
Yes, there is a question. On the issue of prison divestment, you cannot negotiate with industries in the prison industrial complex. Their job is caging people, specifically black and brown people. Just as Professor Cornel West said, the KKK's job was racial terrorism, right? So when we're thinking about these issues, the urgency needs to be addressed here, right? And there is no negotiation engagement with corporations like Geo Group, like corporations like CoreCivic. And so I'm wondering, and I would like a clear and direct answer on this one. Why do you believe that education should be funded by incarceration, which is slavery, which is the destruction of individuals and communities? Why have you refused to comment on our campaign specifically? And why do you think that the university should be invested in the prison industrial complex?
So I have met, as you've observed, with your group multiple times in office hours. We had a civil conversation until it was ended when those representatives said, we demand that you do the following. And I said, I thought we were having a conversation about the topic. This, by the way, is something that, unlike the fossil fuel divestment issue, which has been on the agenda for the corporation, for the university for some time, to my knowledge, has not been before us previously. I served on the Corporation Committee on Shareholder Responsibility when I was a member of the corporation before I became president. And on multiple occasions, we've had conversations with students and with faculty members over issues of fossil fuels. I would be happy to broker meetings with students and faculty who care about these issues with the Corporation Committee on Shareholder Responsibility. That's where we consider these things. At the meeting last Thursday, I stood up and I said, I would be happy to talk to you. That's on the YouTube video, you can see it. I said, we are willing to have you stand here and protest. Okay, just allow the event to go on. That's all I asked at the time. I don't think that was calling anybody out in any way. I said, we can have a conversation about this. But there were people for that event who had traveled long distances to come hear a conversation about the role of universities in promoting economic opportunity. And that conversation didn't take place because people wouldn't allow it to go forward. I published my article in the Crimson because I wanted to have this conversation. I said, look, we can talk about these issues.
And yet you still haven't reached out to our campaign.
Well, I think I just did. I think I just said, we have processes for engaging with these sorts of things. And we're happy, I'm happy to ensure that the Corporation Committee on Shareholder Responsibility talks. I've met with students who've come to see me at office hours. At that meeting, I offered to meet with you then. I'm proud of what we've done as an institution to try, through our scholarship, to try and address issues of mass incarceration.
Elizabeth Hinton and
Elizabeth was one of the first faculty members I met with when I became president. I'm proud of the work of my classmate, Patty Saris, my law school classmate, who was actually in my study group, who chaired the Federal Sentencing Commission that recommended the new sentencing guidelines that have now been incorporated into law that have reduced mass incarceration. I'm proud of the fact that we've honored Brian Stevenson with an honorary degree, that he's going to be speaking on our campus again in a few weeks. I think as an institution, we have much to contribute to this issue, and we should. It's what we're about as an institution.
So,
I have no problem.
Sorry to cut off the response, but we've got about 10 minutes, so we're going to try to get to as many questions as
What about the
possible.
question that she asked?
Yeah.
I can repeat it if you want.
We're going to try to get to more questions. I'm sorry if that's the feeling in the room, but we want to hear as many voices as possible.
It's the reality in the room.
Yes.
Let's preface what I'm going to say to phrase the actual question with a statement about the fact that the Corporation Committee on Social Responsibility and the Advisory Committee on Social Responsibility, which up until now have confined themselves to taking into consideration engagement via shareholder resolutions, no matter how it should vote on those or not. They really have not taken the larger question of investment responsibility as a topic for either their own consideration or something that they could bring to the larger Harvard community.
Is there a question, if you don't mind just getting to it as quickly as you can?
So I wanted to ask, could there be an evolution of those committees? One thing, I think that's especially a worthwhile goal at this point, given that Harvard is much less so directly owning any stocks. There's a much smaller roster of stocks to be taken into consideration. And should they do so, would it not be possible, in fact, to address these various other concerns and demands that you are worried would come to the fore immediately post-divestment? I think it's certainly...
All right, we'll leave it at that question if that's all right, and allow the panelists to respond.
Would you like to
Were you directing the question at a specific member of the panel?
I think obviously with President Bacow having been on that committee and being the most knowledgeable about it, it would be...
So look, it's a good question, and we have shifted the way in which the endowment is invested away from, managing funds internally, using external managers. It does raise questions about what is the role of these committees. It's under active discussion right now within the Corporation Committee on Shareholder Responsibility and the Advisory Committee on Shareholder Responsibility. We're talking about exactly how their mandates ought to be reframed. So your issue is being addressed currently.
So were that to happen, just to...
We're going to move on to the next question, if that's okay.
Yes.
So, President Bacow, first off, you claim that firms, okay, actually, I'm going to say some things that I know are true, and then I have a question for you. One, firms will never look out for public interest. That's just never going to happen. That will never, ever, ever happen. They will always look out for their own interest, and right now their own interest sits with profiting off of the destruction of our planet and the killing of other human beings. Not to mention a myriad of other things. Money is a voice, and I don't have any money. Therefore, I don't have a voice. Harvard has a lot of money. Therefore, you, by proxy, have a lot of voice. And you, as a beacon of what Harvard represents for so many people around the world, can stand on top of this pedestal and say things that the world needs to hear. In this case, we need to divest from fossil fuel as a world, as a entire global community. We need to divest from these things. This is a baseline. Divestment from private prisons is a baseline. We will eventually get to the rest of those things, but I think it's important.
Just split it up a little in the interest
Yeah,
of
yeah,
time.
yeah,
So
sorry.
We want to get to
My
the
question
point.
then for you, President Bacow, is are you willing to take an assertive role in the changing of our world, or will you be passive? Because if you are not going to be assertive, then I don't think that I don't have anything to do here.
So I took this job on because I believe in the mission of higher education. I believe in the mission of Harvard University. I believe what we do on this campus is really important. But our primary mission and the primary way in which we affect change in the world is through our teaching and through our scholarship. That is why we exist. It is to change the world, to influence the world through our scholarship and through our teaching. There are other ways that we can influence it as well, but that's the principal reason that we are here. I've been trying to pick my spots and use the bully pulpit that is afforded to me as the president of Harvard for good. I just came back from China, where I spoke on the importance of human rights, on the importance of defending freedom of speech and freedom of expression in a place which does not typically embrace those values. And I will continue to speak out where I think my voice can have an influence.
Actions speak louder.
I think we're gonna move on to another question, and maybe just a suggestion, we can open this up for more of our panelists. And maybe some of them are able to hang around for a little bit afterwards, so, yes, you may ask questions. This is for all of our, for broader panelists. Okay, cool.
So here's my question. My name is Michael Zeldin. I'm a resident fellow in the grade 50 year for one semester. So I get to travel by site in Washington, D.C. I asked my stockbroker, financial advisor, I said to him, I want to divest from possibly a year or so ago. Let me define it for me. What is divestment? What does divestment mean for you? Is it just exploration and extraction? Is it transshipment? Is it investment in companies that use petroleum for their products? And I said to him, I want to get rid of as much of it as I can. We'll liquidate your portfolio. I said, fine. And we invested in what's supposed to be socially responsible
Maybe get to
programs. So my question is, how are you guys defining divestment? And he said to me, my partner said, are you divesting personally from your own use of petroleum-based products? And I said, sure. So if you can tell me what divestment, how you define divestment, to what extent, what's the breadth and depth of it, so that when we're talking about divestment, we have a clearer definition of it. I appreciate that.
Maybe we'll get some new voices.
Well, I know
That's for the left. That's for
addressed to the president, but since
No,
I
it wasn't
haven't been
addressed to the
in,
president.
oh, anyone,
addressed to you
okay.
guys.
It's addressed to,
Okay.
it's
All
actually
right.
least.
Okay, well, you're
I
welcome
think
this
that's
time.
relevant.
So, by divestment, that's a very good question. What is divestment? You know, where do we draw the border? You know, it's not just the oil and gas companies. It's the pipeline companies. And, you know, look at the human rights abuses that have come about through the pipeline companies, while also contributing to, you know, transporting fuel that's contributing to climate change.
Exploration, extraction, transshipment. Those are the pretty easy ones.
Right.
What else?
We've only got about 2 minutes left in the panel, so if we want.
There's, you know, also been calls for divesting from the rail lines that carry coal. You know, these are some of the easy things that we can do to get started.
I would just say that many institutions have divested and they don't all have the same guidelines.
I'm just asking for
But they all,
that discussion.
they all have particular guidelines and it's not one size fits all. But their aim is to reduce their financial investment in firms that do extract and market fossil fuels. Now, there are different ways that can be done, and different institutions have done it differently. But and it's never perfect because we're in an economy which is enmeshed. It's never perfect. But there are many ways in which institutions have successfully done it already.
I'm not saying otherwise. I just wanted
no.
the definition.
Great. So unfortunately, we have so many questions. We're coming toward the end of our panel. We also just want to be appreciative of the president's time. We know he had a hard stop at 7:30. So that said, Professors Anderson and West, if you want to add anything else to the end of this conversation, since that was addressed more broadly to the panel, then we'll kind of bring this to a close. And thank you all so much for coming again.
Can you stay longer, President Bacow? Can you stay longer?
So
Can you give us
I
more information?
rearranged my schedule to be here. I have a dinner I have to go to. I've got people who are waiting. I pushed it off till 8 o'clock. And I need to get there out of respect for them, so I'm sorry. But I did want to be here, so, and it was called until 7:30, so. You guys want to respond?
To that
If
question?
there are any closing words,
Well, I'd rather just hear some voices from students.
This is a question specifically for you, Cornel West. Do you think Harvard's $40 billion endowment should be held responsible to the community or to Harvard's shareholders as an ethical question?
And if I can just add, and what are our responsibilities to those who've entrusted the resources to us, our donors?
well, We'll also just add that we do recognize, President, we're taking more of your time, so if you need to step out at any point.
But
Go ahead.
I want to just take a stab at that, because I don't think that one can just answer that in one sentence, a cliche or a platitude. You've got a number of different levels one has to be attuned to in order to raise the question. One, how does one reproduce an institution like Harvard? And at the same time, how does such an institution make commitments to truth and justice, especially as it relates to the vulnerable? Now, Harvard does not have a long history of being on the cutting edge of social justice. It just doesn't. The abolitionist movement did not look to the president of Harvard. When Emerson gave his address, he was basically banned for Harvard for 30-some years. Now, he ended up on the board, but so you have to understand that there's a variety of different voices, perspectives in the history of Harvard. Right wing, liberal, left wing, some of them communist, some of them fascist. All of those are members of the Harvard community. That's what it is to be an institution of higher learning in that regard. So that when you raise that question to me, I can give my particular take, but it's going to be a very, very distinctive one that comes out of my own deeply left-wing orientation. And I'm very explicit about that. And at the same time, I've got to learn and listen from other perspectives that have their own arguments and so on. So that in the end, will the community have some kind of purchase on Harvard's money? You know, that's like saying whether America will actually be one in which it would treat its poor and working people with respect and move toward Bernie Sanders and others.
I think
Putting working people and poor people at the center.
I
But
think
that's not the end and aim of a liberal institution of higher learning. So you can bring to bear your voice and the tradition that produced you, but at the same time be respectful of the various perspectives.
a couple of things. So another organization actually has this room for 7:30. So in light of that and the fact that there's a hard stop for 7:30, we're actually going to end the panel there. But if we could just thank all of the panelists.
Got a lot of material right on.